normal dark roast. Okay, so before we get into the topic for today, tell me about the fire you put out with the brush fire truck.
Oh, yeah. Well, it wasn't a super, super big deal, but we got a call that someone's like, I think it was a barn. By the time we got there, I couldn't tell what it was. It was a structure roughly the size of like a trailer house, but I think it was a barn. By the time we got the call, and they were saying that it might go into the brush, so that's why they were like, hop in the brush truck, follow the engine. And we had just got off a medical call too, so we weren't even at the station. We were already driving and stuff. I think that's how it went. I can't remember. No, we went on the fire call, and then we had a call after. So I ended up going to a medical call on the brush truck too, which is weird. Anyways, that's another story. But yeah, so I hop in my little brush truck, and I'm all excited with all my gear. I always, at that point, when I hop in whatever vehicle where I'm going to the emergency, that's when I kind of pray and refocus my mind so that I'm in the moment. And it was Sunday, and so I was reading. I was actually reading about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace, and so the verses on my mind were the ones about, like, you know, even though they were in the furnace, no fire touched their hair or their skin or their clothes or anything like that. So that was pretty baller. It's a pretty cool thought going in towards the fire. But that was kind of just my prayer too. It's like, you know, if it's burning and we're there, hopefully we have the strength to help other people and, you know, that sort of thing. So we get there, and it really wasn't too big of a deal. The structure had already collapsed because it was either like a side-by-side or a little barn. So it just kind of went up in flames and then was collapsed, but still burning, but just kind of char all over the ground. It wasn't so big of a deal. So they were, instead of like lining up the engine, like the big fire engine to fight the fire, they were like, hey, why don't you whip the brush truck around? We'll kind of walk you through putting out these different things. So there was like these different posts that were still burning a little bit, like on the tops, and then different piles that were burning. And so they got me to pull out the reel, which is like a hose on a reel on the top of the truck. You can just grab and run. We got water flowing to the hose, and they were like, all right, you know, point and shoot. You're going to spray at this until it goes out, and then you're going to spray at this. And a couple of the more senior firemen were having a good time teaching me and making some fun jokes. They're like, they said I'd be really good at the water gun games at a carnival, so that's probably a good compliment. But yeah, it ended up going out pretty easily. I think by the time, like, I pretty much soaked everything, got everything put out in about 15-20 minutes, so nothing too bad. And then cleaned it up, and they taught me how to fill up the truck back with water. We went to a hydrant, and yep, done deal. And then from there we got a medical call, and then that got canceled, thank goodness. Well, we got taken off the call. Someone else responded. So thank goodness for us, but hopefully the other person's okay.
Hopefully the other person's fine, yeah. Well, that's cool. You got a little on-site training. That's fun.
Yeah.
It's probably good to have some opportunities like that early on.
Definitely. And I feel very blessed, because if I was a recruit in like Charleston, the city, I wouldn't be doing any of this. They wouldn't let me go on any calls. I would just be at the station full time, and I would do only basically like sweeping and maintenance, things like that. And then when I get out of recruit school, I would have a very specific job like assigned to me, and it would be like, stand by the hydrant. That's it. That's your whole job for a few months. So I feel blessed to be in a more rural area at a smaller station where like I actually get a bunch of hands-on stuff. Like I'm there on the medical calls. I'm there on the fire calls. So that's been fun.
I'll have to do some looking around more at what stations I want to apply to, because there's a few that I've done a little bit of looking since we last talked, and there's a few around that, well, my local one in Bow, I think, is just volunteer only, which makes sense, because I don't think it's not a very big town, and we don't have, I mean, it's the type of thing where like if there's a fire, you hear about it, you know. But there's definitely some more rural towns around me that are bigger that might have more options. I could go to Concord, which is the capital. Concord's not huge, so maybe I'd get to do some stuff. I don't know. But certainly like Manchester or Nashua or like the bigger cities around here, I probably would be in that sort of situation you were describing. which is fine.
Yeah.
I'm willing to do the humble work for a while if that's what's got to be done. But
Yeah.
and then to update on the whole training regiment, I was talking to one of my friends at work who's really big on nutrition science and stuff. And I decided
Yeah.
what I was doing so far was I was waking up in the morning, doing calisthenics, doing running, and on top of that, I was doing a major carb cut. So like pretty much, I don't know about zero carbs. Like I'm not measuring it all exactly, but
Yeah.
it's not much. And so I think I'm taking that part out because I have struggled very, very hard with energy because I have a pretty active job. So
Yeah.
like getting up at 5 in the morning has not been easy, and
Uh,
a
that's
couple of
never easy.
a couple of times I missed it, and it's just like when I got home from work, I was just wiped, like completely wiped out, no energy whatsoever. Like I would get home at 8 o'clock and go to bed. But
Yeah.
so I've decided to take that part out. The main reason to do that was to just trim off some fat and kind of, I don't know, maybe look better aesthetically, but that's not really a priority right now. I just got to get faster and stronger. So if
Yeah.
that's, I think that's been a barrier to me being able to get faster and stronger. So I'm cutting that out for now, and I'm just going to focus on getting up and doing my exercises and running and stuff. So
Okay.
anyway, and then yeah, like I said, I've looked around at some departments. I think probably yeah, there's a couple towns I could name that wouldn't mean anything to you that I'm looking at applying to, but
One
yeah,
of those Yankee towns.
that's right. So, okay, now that we've got some updates taken care of, what was I saying we were going to talk about? Oh, yes. Um, so I thought today we could talk a little bit about. It's kind of surprising we haven't done this. We probably should have done this first, but to each talk a little bit about kind of our background with Christianity and philosophy and just life in general, like a little bit of the important points, so people are aware of kind of what we're about and how we've got there. And I figure our stories will probably meet up somewhere at college, and we can kind of finish the rest together. But and I'm sure there will be plenty of branches and tangents we can go off of those things, and interesting stuff to bring up. So. You said you had some stuff written down, which I don't know what exactly written down means. So, but you're more prepared than me, despite me having decided what we were gonna do. So, do you want to start, or do you want me to go ahead and improv?
Let's see what I wrote down. By the way, we are we smoke pipes on this channel, so it's
Oh yeah,
always good to update on what tobacco we're using, what pipe we're using.
yeah. We actually had
That sort.
somebody comment a while back on that we should talk about our blends, and we haven't done that yet. So this is good time for that.
Yeah, great time. Right before we jump into that, I'll say kind of what I'm thinking I'll start with in the episode after we talk about some pipe stuff. A little bit about philosophy, a little bit about Christianity, the relationship between those two things in our lives, and then, like you said, a little bit of just kind of our journey and our walk. But yeah, so you want to go first with your tobacco and pipe and whatnot?
Sure, yeah. So I don't know what this pipe is called. I think they all have names. I know some of them. I've heard of the church warden and the reading pipe, and you have the little clay pipes that have a name that I'm forgetting right now. This one I don't know what it's called. But it is a gift that I got for Christmas when I first started getting into pipe smoking. It's my second pipe. My first pipe, which I'll probably bring around here. I don't know if I'll smoke it, but I'll as a historical relic, I'll bring it around. My first pipe, Koen actually bought me. It's a corn cob pipe. I think I was a little aggressive with scraping, and the bottom's kind of starting to wear a little thin. But it
Yeah.
is still my first pipe, and so it's cool from that perspective. This is my second one. Once I started getting more into it, I got this for Christmas. I wish I was cooler and could tell you all about what the wood was and where it came from and stuff, but I didn't prepare all of that, so I can't.
Do you know
But
what brand it is?
I do know what brand it is because it's right here. It's called Whitlocks. It came in this little box here that I've got.
Very cool.
And inside of the box was all sorts of little, pipe paraphernalia like pipe cleaners and filters and stuff. I don't use filters. I don't know if I should. I've heard that it doesn't matter. So that's kind of what I'm going with. Oh, I messed up the focus a little bit. There we go. But probably what's a little bit more interesting is the blend that I have been smoking here. This I got from a friend. This friend of mine has been pipe smoking for a long time. He is a very outdoorsy kind of guy, owns a cabin up in Vermont, and he has the interesting hobby of foraging for mushrooms, which is fun. So he's got all sorts of knowledge on what you can eat and what'll kill you and what'll trip you out. But he also is pretty knowledgeable about tobacco and kind of herbalism in general. And so he got me this. It's called Caravan. It's a mixture from a company called GL Pace. And that is not
Yeah.
just a company, it is a guy. And he actually has a website that you can check out that's very interesting. He has all sorts of articles and stuff about pipe smoking and tobacco blends and things like this. This particular one is very smoky, not just in the sense that you smoke it, but in the sense that it smells and tastes a little bit like smoked meat, sort of, or it doesn't, like the meat smell isn't there, but the way that smoked meat smells, this smells if it was tobacco. And there's a little blurb on the front, on the top, that I'll read you here. It says, "The finest tobaccos are brought together in careful balance to provide a smoking experience like no other. It is my sincere wish that you will derive as much pleasure from the smoking of this mixture as I have from its creation." And then on the back, the description of the tobacco itself says, "A lovely spice up front mingles with a delightfully exotic oriental flavor. The smoke, leathery flavors of Cyprian Latakia, I don't know where that is, weave their way through the smoke assertively, but never in an overbearing manner. A zesty, delicate sweetness punctuates the statements made by the rest of the tobaccos. The finish is lingering, but won't overstay its welcome." And if I was that discerning, I would agree with all of those things. But it is good. I can confirm that much.
So, today, I'm actually smoking a GL piece as well.
Oh, really?
Mhm. From the Old London series.
I'm familiar. I've looked at his website a little bit.
Yeah, this is the Chelsea Morning. And some of the little sweet writing he wrote on yours, he wrote on mine too. It is a sweet red and bright Virginia's, fragrant Orientals, a bit of rich cypress, Latakia, and just a pinch of Perique. This is a lighter morning blend. It is said to go well with a cup of coffee. So far, it has. I think it is a very rich smelling tobacco. I don't even know how to describe it. Almost, you know how some tobaccos smell really sweet, almost fruity?
Mm-hmm.
This is more of the opposite of that smell. Like, it is a gristly, almost like a bacon and barnyard smell. Like, it is, but it's beautiful at the same time. I'm really enjoying it. This is my second time ever smoking it, and it just tastes phenomenal. Yeah. So I would definitely suggest it. It is very light. Doesn't have a super strong taste, but it smells wonderful. My wife and her friend, we had breakfast outside at this table, and they really enjoyed the smell of it. They enjoyed the fragrance, which is nice because, you don't want to upset company or your wife. So, but they really liked it. They thought it would smell beautiful. So, I think it has a very rich, salty smell.
Mm.
I really am enjoying it. The pipe I'm using today, I handmade out of a piece of, I believe, like 75-year-old live oak, which is what's local to South Carolina. A lot of them are protected. This one came down in a storm. I was able to get a few pieces of it, and I made this pipe by hand. Still sucking out a few wood chips when I smoke it, but aside from that, it's worked pretty good. But yeah.
Well, very good. So, commenter from like 4 videos ago. There's your answer. That's what we're smoking. The wind's fighting me a little bit here.
Yeah. All right. So yeah.
Yeah,
I
fall
think the
gets very windy
question.
around here. Sorry.
What was that?
I was just saying, fall gets very windy around here. Like, I don't know why, it just comes with the season. Anyway.
No, you're fine. So you had kind of brought up a question a while ago of basically even family members and friends who love you have kind of presented you with a question very commonly of how do you reconcile religion at large, not just Christianity, with being a student of philosophy, as if they're in large opposition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a question a lot of people have. And I think it's a shame, but it does almost seem like the misnomer or the misassociation of modern society with philosophy is that philosophy and religion are at a crossroads, and that somehow you decide to either be a logical, reasonable thinker or a religious person, and that those aren't crossed over, or that somehow by being hyper intelligent or well studied will lead you away from religion as well. I think it's a very common question. I've been posed with it a few times. I think you may have more than me even. Just being that you came to your faith a little later, almost around the same time you really started diving into philosophy, which sets a lot of people kind of off and thinking,
Yeah.
well, how did that even happen? But I won't tell your story. But yeah, my personal experience was a little bit different stepping into philosophy than yours was, I believe. I had no real interest in philosophy growing up, or in history, or in much other than sports and fun. By the time I got to college, I really didn't even enjoy studying that much at all. I was learning slowly that I did enjoy some aspects of academics. But by and large, I was a very poor student, and I didn't want to be much better. I did just enough to survive and just enough to keep playing sports. But I had real no direction in terms of my academic future, and I didn't know where that would take me. But I did have a very strong faith background, and I was always taught to be a free thinker. And my father studied philosophy a little more. So even our conversations around the household involved, relatively high levels of thinking, or at least good question asking, learning how to ask good questions. So growing up, I had a background of being able to think and ask good questions. I didn't know how to use it or how to apply it, but I did have a lot of big questions about the faith. I had a lot of doubts. I had a lot of reason to wonder about every religion and why anyone would believe in anything at all, never mind Christianity specifically. But those were still sort of haunting me and plaguing me deep into my college career. And I definitely started to struggle with it, but I did pick up reading more thanks to one of my classes. I took a great books class, so a literature class that got me reading some older literature, and it started to open my mind up to how great different thinkers and writers have been throughout the ages. everything from some of the ancient philosophers um, to ancient religious works. I just really started diving into reading and really loving it. We read all sorts of things. Um, we read, sorry, I'm blanking. We read Utopia. We read The Divine Comedy. We read Boethius. We didn't do too much of the philosophers, but a few of the later ones. Um, mostly just ancient literature works. Um, and then a few excerpts from the Summa, which is a religious text. Um, and then that was my groundwork. That was my foundation. And I sort of left it behind because even though I enjoyed it, I didn't think that it would be something I could make a career out of. And at the time, I assumed that was the only thing I needed college for, was making a career, which I was very wrong. But from then, we moved to a different state, to a different college, and I sort of got into old habits of not studying, just reading in my free time, but not really taking advantage of college, and moved to another state, got into another school, was finishing out my athletic career. At that point, I had played some semi-professional soccer and some high-level collegiate soccer, and I had another year left of college, but I had already played for 4 years, so I was going on my 5th year, and I just needed to dive into academics a little more. And my last season of soccer, so my 4th year of college, of the 5 I attended, I started diving into. I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I took the opportunity at the new school. They offered a philosophy program, and my father told me I would enjoy it, so I should give it a try instead of dropping out. I dove into it, and he was right. I loved studying. I loved learning. I felt like for the first time it was something I couldn't cheat at. Not to say I was always trying to cheat, just that there was no way to get around thinking. I couldn't use a calculator. I couldn't Google search. I couldn't, look at a biology textbook, memorize it for a quiz, and then jump to the quiz and do good in biology. Like, that's how my habits were. So I just had no appreciation for the knowledge, even though it is, not to discredit the sciences. That was me. Philosophy, I couldn't do that. I had to dive in for hours at a time to read and digest. And even then, I was just starting to understand how to learn and how to read and how to think. And one of the first classes I took at Evangel, which was my final destination in terms of schools, was a deductive logic class, which I've talked a little bit about before. Sort of refined my thinking, taught me the importance of thinking, and how to sort of understand ideas, how to formulate questions. And it also, see, I wrote something down here. Oh, it just taught me to take things a little more seriously in terms of any sort of idea. It taught me how to dissect it and understand it, which just then led me to take more ideas more seriously. More religious ideas, more scientific ideas, more theoretical ideas, more of everything I started to understand and could palate, and, following that, could take it more seriously. So I started to weigh a lot more. I started talking with you a lot more. And I think there were some personal things in my life that I was really trying to figure out. And I started really, in a healthy way, diving into asking questions about the faith, learning the history of Christianity, Judaism, spending more time studying ancient religions around the world, ancient people groups around the world, doing the best I could to kind of piece together what I believed was my best guess at how to make sense of the universe coming into existence, the world coming into existence, humanity, the nature of humanity. I think the sort of maybe duality of man that's non-physical and physical, and then learning the importance of truth and absolute truth and truth in life. And all of these things were starting to culminate into me realizing the importance of believing in something, and then trying to figure out what that was. And to the best of my knowledge, using all of my tools from biology and chemistry and physics, and all of my tools from math, all of my tools from history that I'd studied throughout my college years, and then finally getting to the point where I was in philosophy as a major, pieced that together, and I realized that there's only one way, and I believe that that way is through Jesus Christ, and that it is through the Bible. And yeah, that's, even though that was long, that's sort of the short answer to how did I reconcile it. I'd always been wondering, always been questioning. I finally learned how to ask good questions, and I was able to sort of step into a new faith, a restored one, with a much deeper understanding. And I will probably spend the rest of my life learning and trying to understand more. But I think that that's the best anyone can do.
Yeah.
Is to always be asking, right? And always be trying to learn. And so philosophy has been the tools I've used to try to understand things. And that's what I think is the misnomer about philosophy. People think that if you dive into philosophy, itself is its own way of thinking, is its own subscription, its own ideology, its own religion. It's not. Philosophy is like science. It's like a hammer. Philosophy is the tool to help you. Science is the tool to help us, create medicine or track things back. It's a tool for things, just as a hammer is a tool for things, just as a pipe, philosophy is a tool. So you learn how to use the tool, and once you learn how to use it, it would make sense if you applied it. That's how I reconciled it with any religion.
Yeah.
Is the tool to help me better understand all of them.
Yeah, I think that's a very succinct and wise way to put it. I've thought of it like that. I don't know if I've articulated it like that to people when they kind of ask me, like, oh yeah, hey, what are you doing with this philosophy and religion stuff? But that's good. It's interesting. So like, I of course know kind of most of this stuff that you were talking about, but it's just interesting to hear it articulated like this. Like, we've sort of come to know these things about each other over time, and to like have it all in one kind of continuum like that highlighted a few different things for me. One of them is that you've had an experience which, not to say that it isn't unique, because it is in many ways, but you've had an experience that I think a lot of people can relate to, in terms of, it seems almost as though you've worked backwards through, how would I say, worldviews, something like that. Because you started from, many people who were raised in the Christian family have this experience of starting with the faith of your parents and not following it all the way, or maybe their parents didn't have the tools to give them to understand. And it's, so you start there, and then you go into science in school, which of course is, I think, arguably a step below, or maybe a step above even, I don't know, religion in like the continuum of figuring out truth about the universe, and then math, which is even more rudimentary, and then philosophy, which is fundamental to all of it. And so it's an interesting order, because of course when you look at the history of philosophy, especially in ancient Greece, you can see the reverse of that process taking place. They begin with philosophy and metaphysics and things like this, and then move into math and science. And I don't, that's just an observation I wanted to throw out. I don't know exactly what to think about that, if that's worse or better or indifferent. I don't know, but I definitely think it's something that a lot of people can relate to and are experiencing now. Maybe just as a consequence of our education system and where it starts us and what it deems as important to teach us about. And maybe as a result of our church education systems as well. I think your parents are probably better equipped than many, but I think a lot of people would have the experience that their parents who are Christian, weren't equipped to bring them into the faith properly. You hear some Bible stories growing up. That's a feature of my upbringing that you're going to hear whenever I start talking about that. But Yeah, so that's one thing I wanted to throw out. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I thought it was funny that you were kind of asking like, is that a better way? And in that same vein, like, it was just the way. And unfortunately, that is just the way that's in front of a lot of us. Is like, at this point, you don't get to decide what you step into first. Like, even if, well, and I don't want to belittle anyone, even if you only have a high school degree, which I think is good and very important and worth congratulations. But let's say you have a high school degree. At that point, you have spent many hours, whether you liked it or not, studying history, literature, and science. And so those are your foundations. And what's likely the case, as was for me, even though I was at private Christian schools, is I really hadn't put that much time into learning how to think or learning about what was the nature of the universe or humanity or even God or any sort of religion. So the groundwork that you have is unfortunately the American public school system or even private school system, which is really, like you're saying, rooted in mathematics and sciences. So that is just the groundwork.
Mhm.
That's the groundwork. So you got to move from there. You got to.
Yeah, you
You,
work
you
with what
can't
you
stay
got.
satisfied, you know?
Mhm. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, another thing that I thought was interesting was, and something to highlight, is what you were talking about regarding things being tools. I think people don't look at them that way. Whether it's math or science or philosophy,
yeah.
they're systems created to be good at, to make you good at doing something specific. Um, this is something I think the misunderstanding of that is something you see with science a lot. Science is sort of purported as a worldview, almost in the same way that you were saying people misunderstand philosophy as its own
Yeah.
worldview. But it's simply clearly not. The
Which does a service to the individual and science,
and
unfortunately.
science, yes, and philosophy, and anything you might mischaracterize there. I think it's interesting. The one of the subjects that doesn't get conflated as a worldview is math, but I almost feel like that's the one that could be the closest. Because it influences so much of what's at the root of nature and the physical world, and informs a lot of patterns and biology and all of these things that are very personal to us. It's not really taught in that light. If it was, I'd probably have given it more time of day while I was in school. But
And I think part of that may be due to the nature of math. I feel like it's such a rudimentary tool. It's
Mhm.
such a groundwork tool that it's actually a part of all of the other toolboxes, like
Yeah.
philosophy, science, everything actually has roots in these rudimentary tools, like
Mhm.
speaking and math and things like that. So, but there are some people who even like our good friend Justin Murphy, God
Yeah,
bless him,
Dr. Justin. God
who
bless you.
has yeah, who has really honed that tool to a level that I have not.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some obviously greater than even Justin Murphy, um, who have taken that rudimentary tool and really honed it, almost like a skilled craftsman. And that's just such a rare thing that I think that's why it's not put forward as a worldview,
Yeah.
because it is a rudimentary tool. It is powerful, but so few people take it to that level
Mhm.
of it being their worldview.
Yeah, and to some people it makes sort of intuitive sense, and to others I think it's difficult. Like it was hard for, like, beyond. I would have considered myself good at math up until like pre-calculus. I was like, I understand what a variable is. I understand how fractions and decimals work. That all makes sense. But once you start introducing me to logarithms and graphing and stuff, I kind of got lost very, very quickly. Um, but yeah, so I think these things that are tools are conflated as worldviews, science in particular, and philosophy. And that's just something that's helpful to know when you're going into a conversation with somebody, because that's almost often one of the first fundamentals you need to correct in order for them to understand you. I've found that is helpful in a lot of conversations I've had where people have asked me, how do I resolve the conflict between between philosophy and religion, rather. And it's just not a conflict. But if you misunderstand
Yeah.
what philosophy is, or you misunderstand what science is, then of course it would seem that way.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are a few thoughts on that.
Definitely. Why don't you dive in and
Yeah,
start giving your story and kind of go from there?
sounds good. So my parents were both raised vaguely Christian. My mom had a sort of Protestant background. Her family would go to church growing up. My dad grew up Catholic. By the time they got married and had us, I would think it's fair to say, and I do not mean to speak ill of my parents at all. I love them very dearly. We're very close, and they've given me more than I could have ever asked for. But I think it's fair to say that they were a little lukewarm by the time they got together. And they, as I was saying before, they weren't provided the tools, really. They didn't have the tools to give me, or my sister, for that matter, to really understand and grasp these things, these big questions. And that was, I think, a big stopping point for me for most of my life. I was, and I don't mean to sound self-aggrandizing in any way when I say this is just the way it was. I always had questions about big and deep things.
Mm-hmm.
An example that I bring up is, I didn't have nightmares very often when I was a kid, but when I was going to sleep, I would be kept awake by these questions that I didn't even know how to ask, let alone answer. And there was one night when I was very young that I remember realizing and understanding that I was going to die and being very upset about that and unsure of what that would look like and how anything matters, kind of, in light of that fact. And these are not things that I thought of when I was a little child, but these are the types of questions that were occurring to me and I didn't know what to do with.
Yeah.
And of course my parents didn't know what to do with them either. I called for my mom and she was like, "Oh, what's wrong? Like, did you have a nightmare or whatever?" And I'm like, "No." And she's like, "Well, what's wrong?" And I'm like, "I don't know." I don't know what's wrong. Yeah, something like that. It's a memory my mom definitely recalls. And so, but I'm not. I say I'm not trying to be self-aggrandizing, and the evidence of that is the fact that I never did anything about it. I had these questions for a long time, and they were almost like I don't know, a plague, sort of, that I wanted to get rid of. And when I was growing up, I was never super interested in the religion of my parents. We would go to church, and they would promise me a pencil if I came up and prayed my sin away, and I was like, this seems all a little uninteresting. And so I wasn't, that never seemed like a spot that I could go to for answers to me. And so by the time I was old enough to think about it, I would say functionally agnostic. I wouldn't have used that word or had that word to be able to say. But I basically assumed that things didn't really matter, and that these questions that were occurring to me were silly and pointless, and I should kind of put them away. And that was in part due to the friends that I had, that I think were a negative influence on me at that time. Sort of like, I don't know, insufferable intellectual types that are, militant about not swearing and good at school and like to rub it in people's faces. The types of people in middle school that you and I would have hated. That's who I was hanging out with. So that didn't help. And I got to a point where I had, as far as I could tell, nothing to really be miserable about, but I was kind of miserable. I was very lonely. I think I'm very prone to loneliness as a person in general, which is ironic because I've been blessed with a lot of incredible family and friends and such. But at the time, I felt that there was pretty much nobody else that was dealing with what I was dealing with in terms of these questions, and that I was always trying to be a good kid. I wanted to, make my parents proud and stuff. So I never did anything like crazy. Um,
Mhm.
but it wasn't, there was no virtue behind that. It was just I didn't want to make problems. But I also didn't have the things to ground me on like why those things mattered and why the things that they were asking me to do or not do mattered. Um, and so when I came across the idea of philosophy, even though I wouldn't have termed it like that at the time, it was kind of like a soothing balm in a way, kind of like the thing that I had been looking for without actually actively looking for it. I sort of stumbled upon it. Became a little bit interested in political matters and kind of started listening to some various political commentators and was taken by the conservative ones. And despite how I make fun of the Republicans now, I I owe a lot to them in terms, some of the people that I listened to at the time, I owe a lot to them in terms of where I am today, because many of them were Christian, and to varying degrees of that. I don't know, I don't know exactly how they would define that, but many of them at least were talking about these things, and so I was like, okay, if these people that have good ideas or ideas that seem good to me are Christian, maybe I should look into that. And
Yeah.
part of my motivation to dive into that too also came from my interest in story. I've always been a big reader, and it's been my ambition for a long time to write, particularly fiction. And I was very taken with myths, and in a similar way to how Tolkien or C.S. Lewis would describe in like their kind of biographical works or interviews or such, I had a desire for the mythical. Um, I didn't think it was real, which was sort of a hopeless place to be in, but I thought it was cool and interesting, and there wasn't, anything in the world that sort of compared to that. So I was already familiar with a lot of these ideas, and I started kind of looking into them more specifically, and I never had thought to view Christianity as a myth, or even as an interesting myth. In my head, Christianity was, going to Sunday school and getting pencils for praying the sinner's prayer and whatever, wearing uncomfortable clothes in the mornings on my weekends. So that was never a place I could go to for that kind of thing. But these, people that I listen to online sort of seem to view it like that, and so I started to see it like that too. And at that
Yeah.
time, we had moved, and my father had gone through sort of a spiritual reawakening, I would say. He got a offer for a job, and it would uproot us from where we had been where they had been for going on 15 years, where I had been for 10 or 13 maybe, and they'd been there for maybe longer than that. My mother had lived there her whole life, so it was a big thing, a big change is my point. And so he started praying about it very seriously, and he felt that he got an answer, whatever that looked like. I don't know exactly how he would describe that, but I would leave that to him. But whatever it was, it reawakened sort of his, I guess, religious fervor, and he wanted our family to start going to church again, which we had stopped doing for probably 10 years, I want to say. And so
Yeah.
we started going again as a family, and there was a local pastor here, who really poured into me and sort of recognized the questions that I had, and he was somebody who had and searched for answers to the same questions, and that was something that I'd never seen before or met before, and so that was a huge blessing. I learned a lot from him and sort of started to convert, I think, or revert, I guess you would say. I don't exactly know how to term it. It didn't feel like I was ever Christian up until that point, or anything approximating it. At least in terms of what Christianity actually is. And there was a long period of study where I wasn't all the way in, but eventually I got baptized at 18 in my senior year of high school. And I decided to go to a Christian school. I was actually not interested in going to college at all, but mostly because I didn't think that many of the places around here in New England had much to offer me for the $60,000 per year price tag. But I think I was probably right about that. That was one of the few things that I think I was probably right about at that time. And so I ended up going to Evangel, which we've spoken about on the show here before. And philosophy just was the next natural step for me. I just knew that that's what I wanted to do. I knew that I needed to kind of answer a lot of these questions that I had had for so long and not known what to do with. And probably one of the biggest things, besides the education I received from Dr. Smidley, who we've talked about on this channel before, is something of a cure to the loneliness I had had for a long time.
Yeah.
I met mostly that came through that healing process started with my pastor that I'd met, and I think picked up when I met you. We just thought very similarly, and I had never met anybody or had the opportunity to meet anybody that thought like that. And since then, I have some friends that I have influenced to get there, which has been a blessing. But
That's all.
But yeah, so essentially, to boil down that long and probably rambling story, philosophy was a cure to questions that I viewed as a burden or a problem, and came to, and it offered me a place that said, those are maybe not normal, but they're questions that you should have, and they're things that should be answered, and we have the tools to do it. And actually, there's a whole tradition stretching back thousands of years of people who have had those questions and sought to answer them. And not only that, but there's people now that are seeking to answer those questions. You being one of them, our teacher, other students that we've met through college. And so in a lot of ways, it basically, philosophy, I started with philosophy really before going into religion, but it wasn't because I was smart about it. It was it was just because I happened to have these questions that needed answers, and I couldn't find the answers anywhere else.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of changes and stuff that I went through in school that are more religious in nature that we could talk about, but maybe that's best to say for another day.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't mind diving into them, but I think you kind of did a good job of reiterating some of the more important parts of your story that we may have touched on before. I can't fully remember, but just especially with, like you're saying, in terms of reconciling religion at large again in your life with philosophy, which is sort of the topic, I think, if there is one for these things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also wanted to kind of touch on, you mentioned this sort of like loneliness. And I think that's a very big thing, that feeling of loneliness. And the more that I've tried to sit back and observe some of the great men that I've known in my life, the more I've seen how beautifully they've handled that. And I've seen that I think most men feel that at some point. Some much later, they have a realization, some more early on. But there's definitely a sense of loneliness that, and I won't speak on behalf of women because I'm not one. But that as a man, I've seen and I have felt that feels almost just like as a part of being a human and being a man. And there's a whole sort of thought we could go down into that. Yes, but men are lonely. I think that is part of, and it may be part of all humans, but as far as I know, being a man and coming into manhood and starting to take on burdens and responsibilities is some of the best things that you can do. But it also makes you realize that you are alone in a lot of ways.
Yep. And there's a
But
lot of that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
oh, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just there's a lot of that that's still unresolved in me, and I
Mhm.
think that might just be the case forever. And I come to this conclusion through mostly my theology studies. I think man was made for God, and by man I mean all people.
Yeah.
Um, and to have that relationship with the fullness of God, whatever that is, um, and everything that we have here or have access to is sort of an imitation of that, or a piece of that, or a reflection of that, however you want to see it.
Mhm.
Um, and so it sort of feels like, before I had some friends, but they didn't really actually have that much in common with me, or I didn't have that much in common with them. And now I have friends that I have a lot in common with, and so I don't feel so lonely. But then, you kind of get comfortable with that, and you sort of want the next thing. So now I want a life partner to, be married to, and then maybe you want children and all of these things. But I've heard people who have those things still feel that lonesomeness, almost as though like even if you go after the most transcendent goods in life, raising a family, being a father, being a good man, being, whatever, pursuing whatever craft you're inclined to, it all will sort of turn to dust if you try to hold on to it too tightly,
Yeah.
because all of those things are just pieces or reflections of God and his character. And that's what you really want. And you don't really know how to conceive of that. You can conceive of these little things that you want, but to understand that there's a whole that unites all of these things, and that's what you're after. I've sort of tried to articulate this idea before when we talked about beauty and how you sort of want to have it and do interact with it in a way that you can't really. And I think that's just the case. I think you can't do that without the fullness of the divine, and I think you're not going to get that until new heaven and new earth and all of that.
Yeah. Um, as far as what I've learned about it, though, I wanted to kind of touch again on. I like that, and I want to circle back to that too. But in terms of how I've personally grown in the past year, I have noticed a few things um, in the realm of loneliness. I think
Mm-hmm.
um, people are lonely, and I've begun to think that the loneliness, that feeling of it, or maybe not that, but loneliness itself is not the problem.
Mm-hmm.
um, but I think it's the sort of unsettled lack of peace that begins to infect you if you don't have, like you were saying, these healthy pursuits. That's the problem. That's what starts to eat at you, is when you're not striving for what is good and you're not aiming at something pure. Um, you're not working hard. You don't have family. You don't have a significant other or friends, or most importantly, if you don't have God to look towards, then that loneliness starts to eat at you in different ways, I think. And I think that's where the problem lies, because I will say being married has made me a lot less alone. Um, and it's been beautiful. And I think it's been, in a lot of ways, it's caused me to look back in the early parts of the Bible, like even as far back as when man and woman was created. Not to get into whatever that means, just that at least symbolically, there's a sort of next step that's taken in Genesis where it's man has all of these things at his disposal. He has, all of the company of every creature on earth except that perfect partner, which is woman. Um, and so I will say being married has put a lot more responsibilities on me, which have made me happier.
Mm-hmm.
like like wanting to strive for more so that I can be more useful, more helpful, and even just things like love and being together, that has helped. But more than that is it caused me to remember my union with God, because I made a union with a person and with God for eternity. And that has caused me to once again look back at the infinite, divine, absolute truth, and with new eyes, sort of have purpose again, sort of have drive and motivation. And that there are moments where I'll be alone, when this call ends and my wife is at work right now, I'll be alone. But there's so much right now in terms of just direction that I have in front of me, that if I do let darkness seep in, it's my own doing. And I know that. And it always is. It always is. But now more than ever, I know that. I know that I have no excuse and no reason, even when I'm alone, to have that sort of dark loneliness and sort of, whatever that is, seep back in, because I have the infinite truth to look towards, and I have a relationship with God that has helped me learn so much more about what it means to be a man. And I think even now I'm more prepared than ever to face darkness, face everything that can be thrown. And that doesn't mean that I wouldn't be alone in those scenarios, just that I've learned the importance of I'm starting to learn the importance of being a man, I think. And I think in a lot of ways, like, I'm never quite as lonely when I'm with my wife, but it's not, like, if you're looking for your wife to satisfy every single part of everything in your life, then they're always going to fall short. And I think that would be a huge disservice to you, your wife, and to everything. And so that's not the answer. That's not the answer to the universe, is having a wife, even though it is the perfect partner. And I am so beyond grateful, and I don't deserve to have a wife as wonderful as I do. And that's been a blessing from God. That's not the answer to infinite universal questions, which are like, what does it mean to, chase after perfection, which is something now that we both have sworn to do together. That still means in those moments we are helping each other do that, and that's, I guess I took a long way to get to this point, but our goal is to help each other be better. And we both still have to pursue being better as individuals, because that's who we are. That's how it works.
Right. So
it's not like, we're just conglomerated into one being. That's not quite how it works. We have now made an oath for all of time to help each other constantly look to God. So we're alone together. And it's beautiful, and it's not a sad thing, but it is. I want to sort of answer the question of, is there a point in your earthly lifetime where you're not alone as a man or a woman? I don't think that there is, but I also don't think that means that you're lonely. I think there can be a point where you're alone and not lonely.
Right.
Which, before my deeper relationship with God and before my wife, I think it was the opposite. I would still find ways to not be alone, but I would still be lonely.
Yeah.
Now,
it does make sense. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead. I was trying to find a way to wrap up.
It does make sense. It does make sense that if it's true that you can be alone and not lonely, or if it's true that you can be not alone and lonely, it feels like it follows that you can be the opposite, that you can be actually alone but not lonely. Mostly because those two things are, the first shows us that those two things are not necessarily always together, Aloneness and loneliness don't always work in the same linear progression. Um, and I think it's interesting that you said, like, yeah, being alone together, I think is a fun phrasing.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good one. I think, in a way, our loneliness. I'm rethinking this now. What I was going to say is I think that in a way our loneliness is part of the divine image. But what I meant by that is that when you think of God before time or before the world or before any of this, it's just him. Um, but even that's not exactly true because there's the Trinity. Although there's a theological doctrine that says the Trinity exists because God's love is generative in the same way that love between a man and a woman is generative. It, produces something to love. And I think maybe that's that's certainly the image that marriage is supposed to symbolize or maybe even be. I don't know if I'm sure it goes deeper than a symbol. I don't know exactly what that means, but I think it does go deeper than a symbol. It's a union on not just a physical level with something else. And I think it's interesting because we always talk about the duality of man, right? So you have the physical body and the spirit, and God, we have the divine image, but God is triune, not dual. Um, and so I don't know if there's a third piece that we're missing, and maybe the third piece that we're missing is actually that whatever harmonizes the other two, because I have the sense that a lot of times my body and my spirit are at war with each other. And I wonder if I could properly resolve those things. Um, if that would be maybe a cure to loneliness. These are kind of disjointed thoughts because I haven't thought about this before, but I was just thinking about it when
Yeah.
you were talking.
Yeah.
So yeah, it
I
almost
also
feels like
wanted
there
to
would be
add
a third piece that's missing that might come with the harmony of the body and the spirit. I don't know. Yeah. So there's that mess for you to deal with.
Yeah. I also wanted to kind of wonder, because I guess this is what philosophy is. So, but
Yeah.
I was curious too if maybe you could almost kind of put aloneness with the physical body and loneliness with the spiritual aspect, physical part. Um, I don't know if that would be an appropriate association, but it almost feels like you can do that.
Seems to make sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you could definitely
Maybe
be
your spirit.
physically, like we said, you can be physically alone and feel lonely, and you can be physically alone and not feel lonely. So they're definitely different. And the loneliness definitely comes from something internal that feels not physical.
Yeah.
But the aloneness is clearly physical.
Yeah.
You could be alone in the woods or together with somebody in your house. And neither of those things necessarily correlate directly to how lonely you feel.
Yeah. 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 Which is why I think we need the tools to help us know to ask those questions, know to kind of get at the root of that, and ultimately pursue absolute truth, which is
Yeah.
the
And
one.
I want to connect that and I want to take this Trinitarian idea that I was kind of foundering about a little further because there's a okay, I want to start by saying I'm not an expert in Trinitarian theology. I am not certain that anybody is, but if there is somebody that's an expert in Trinitarian theology, it's not me. But from what I've learned, there is at least one perspective that suggests that the Spirit is born of the love and union between the Father and the Son. Um, and basically a manifestation of that, and that's kind of what he represents. So if you were to take the family analogy which the Bible often uses, and it's not perfect, of course, because they use the image of Father and Son, and God portrays himself with the mostly masculine, well, not mostly masculine nature, but that's kind of how he chooses to present himself. And but I think that the image of the family is, you know, the husband at the head, the wife as the subordinate to to the husband, and their union generates a child. And I think the idea of the Trinity in this sort of theory of it is that, you know, the father is at the head, the son is subservient to the father, and their love generates the spirit. And so I think maybe it is the case that the answer to loneliness is the spirit, the Holy Spirit, that is, in the human sense. So if you could bring your body and your spirit to love each other, and by that I mean each desiring the good of the other and each working to harmonize the other with truth, which might be, maybe I just said the same thing twice there. Um, you maybe there's a almost a third thing that comes about that sort of completes the divine image or something like this. Because yeah, it does feel like if we're supposed to reflect the image of God or like the nature of God, but we're only dual beings, that sort of falls short. And there's a lot of philosophical traditions, even non-Christian ones, that focus a lot on the harmony between the mind and the body, or the spirit and the body, however you want to term that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are some schools of thought that we've looked at too who do believe there's a sort of triune nature to humanity as well. Maybe that there's something between the mind, the soul, and the body. I definitely wouldn't be quick to discredit that, because there's a lot of times where it feels like there's two parts of me pulling in different directions, and
Yeah.
and I'm sitting still usually, so the body's not a part.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I
That could be
think
the
what's
case too.
commonly referred to as the flesh by a lot of Christian and other religious groups too, isn't necessarily the physical flesh.
Mm.
You know, it's but it's also not the sort of good nature that's pulling in the opposite direction. So
Yeah.
it may be the case that there is a sort of almost Trinitarian divide in humans as well, which would even then be another case to look at the Trinity again with new eyes and kind of, you know, if you were to take the approach of humans being divisible by three almost in nature, you could look at the Trinity again and maybe there's more there to dissect.
There, yeah.
Yeah.
And so the question is, so let's say that you're right. Let's say that there is a spirit and a flesh and a physical body.
Yeah.
We often speak, and we have spoken here on this show, about killing the flesh. Which sort of brings about the question, well, why have it, and when you have to kill it? Why is that part of you? And if it's supposed to be indeed a reflection of the Trinity, then you shouldn't kill it, or at the very least, if you kill it, it has to be resurrected. And so then you have to think, what does that mean?
Yeah. I think of it, I think that's a great way to put it. If I were to put it concisely, I would say that if you're going to kill the flesh, which you need to, something has to resurrect.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go as far as to say that that's almost a constant necessity, because we're not resurrecting something perfect, but something closer.
Right.
But that's also susceptible to falling away. So I would say that may be part of the nature of man, very similar to like, I always approximate it to working out, but like I go into the gym, and if I'm going to be serious about each lift and I want it to be the best it can be, I sort of have to kill the part of me that's weaker and scared and afraid that I can't do one more set, one more rep, or one more workout in order to get to the next level. And then I have to do that every set, every workout, every time I go in, hoping that the stronger part of me is resurrecting at the end of that, so that I can do it again the next day and the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe it would be healthy to do something like that to the flesh, or the spirit of man as well, is like sometimes there are things that are bigger and more noticeable you can cut away, like, you know, bad habits, addictions, bad tendencies, bad thoughts. Some of those are fatty enough where it's easy to slice those off. But that doesn't mean there isn't something that's sneaking in or something that's kind of festering there. And I think with a lot of the sin and the bad behavior of man, it's so hard to cut away everything perfectly that there is something festering.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost because you've let that in, it's now your duty to constantly trim it away.
Mm-hmm.
Prune the tree, constantly keep it growing. And that's that sort of imagery again, because there's something lingering there and we're not perfect, that there is the necessity for constant pruning, constant growth.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we would be fools to say that it's not painful.
Mm-hmm.
So we shouldn't. It would be.
Yeah.
It would be painful
It would be.
to cut that away. But yeah, I think that's part of growing. That's a necessary part of growing is pruning. And that's what your goal is when you aim at the absolute truth, when you aim at the divine. The goal is to prune the flesh, and you'll stumble and you'll fall, and you have to keep rising, keep rising, keep rising. Yeah.
And
And
so,
I,
oh yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say that I've talked to some people, including yourself, about different and myself, if I were to look at myself, about making small steps towards improvement, even such as things like personally picking up better praying habits or picking up better financial habits, picking up habits that are going to be good and going to be honest. But I would also say to you and to a lot of other people that I've tried to help, specifically like in becoming stronger and more capable men, just about being in the gym more.
Mm-hmm.
And some people are very resistant because they know it's going to suck. They know it's going to be hard work. They don't want to be dedicated, and they're afraid that they'll fall away, or they're afraid that they'll stumble, or they'll be insufficient, or that they can't be consistent. And what I've started to do is look at it with a little bit heavier of a perspective. If we were on a desert island, and you got an infection in your leg, and you knew it was going to kill you, and the only thing that would save you would be to cut off the leg, but you're on a desert island, there's no anesthesia, the thing you need to do is cut off your leg. Do you have the cojones to do it or to have it done? And I think a lot of men that I know, a lot of young men that I know, would fight that of, I don't want to feel it, I don't want that to happen, I don't want to lose my leg, even knowing that it's going to be the only way that they have an opportunity to live,
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's dangerous for men, if they're so afraid to take the next step that even they won't listen to a good friend or family member to take one healthy, good step.
Yeah.
I think that's dangerous, because even though it sucks, you just got to do it. You got to rise, you have to go beyond. You have to cut the infection out,
Yeah, and this reminds me of, I think, I can't remember if I read this. I think this is C.S. Lewis, but I wouldn't be surprised if Aquinas said something similar. That courage is the guardian of all the other virtues. And so without courage, you can't have any virtue. Because if your virtue is if you're only virtuous when you don't have to be courageous about it, you're not virtuous.
That's
And
beautiful.
it's so that's like the main one to attain, or maybe the first one to attain, because your work with all the others will be wasted without it.
That's beautiful. And I would also say too, like, for anybody who is afraid to take a positive step, whether that's just getting out of bed earlier or going to the gym or trying to have some healthy habits, maybe that's studying more. The trick with, I think, courage and bravery is like to fake it until you make it, because if I'm running into a burning building and I stop and I'm like, I'm afraid, and I turn around and run the other way, everybody's going to be like, wow, what a coward, you know? But if I'm running into the building and I'm just in my head like, I'm afraid, but I'm going to pretend to be brave, and I run in and I do my thing, I save some people, run out of the burning building, nobody's going to be like, I wonder if he was faking.
Yeah, yeah.
Because even if you thought you were faking it, that's what it is.
Right.
Nobody's perfectly unafraid, you know? That what bravery is the faking it. that
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
brave. It's
Yeah.
that even though there's fear, you jump, you go, you do the thing. You know, you cut out the infection, you go.
Yeah.
And like if that's what it takes, if that is, if being brave and being courageous is what it takes to unlock all of the rest that comes after it, and all you have to do is fake that till you make it.
Mhm.
Well, it sure sounds a lot easier said than done.
Yeah.
But
it's not
it also
undoable.
is that simple, at
Yeah.
least.
Yeah. I also wanted to bring up in relation to some of the stuff that you said about people being afraid to go to the gym because they'll stumble or they'll not be consistent or whatever. Um, this quote comes from an relatively unlikely source. I'll give him a shout out. The YouTube channel I watched. It's just the name of the guy. His name's Jackson Crawford. He's a Colorado cowboy who's probably the world's foremost expert in Old Norse language. um, and it's a very interesting channel. Small channel, but well, relatively small. But it's cool. Anyway, he has been public about the fact that he was an alcoholic for much of his life, and he relatively recently made a video about how he got out of that on the 10-year anniversary of his sobriety. And he was talking about how one of the things that he said that really stuck with me is the reason I've been able to be sober for 10 years is because I was willing to forgive myself for the one time. And I think that's in relation to some of this, to use a term that often comes up in what should I say, more cringe contexts. It fits into the idea of self-love that we've been talking about, or the idea like of God's love between himself and maybe love between the body and the spirit. Forgiveness is a big part of love, and I think forgiveness of yourself so let's say you're trying to go to the gym. If you can't forgive yourself for the one day that you miss, you're not going to go again because you're going to be like, well, I messed it up, and might as well just not go. And that's simply not the case. You're not going to be perfect. You're going to stumble. Because it sucks and because you're weak. And I'm not going to say that's okay, because it's not, but it is what's going to happen. And so you have to be able to set that aside and say, okay, well, I failed that one time, but I'm not going to do it again. He was talking about how if every time he caved and had a drink, he was like, well, that's it, the game's up, I'm done, then he would have gone right back to being an alcoholic. But he didn't do that. Instead, he said, had a little bit of grace for himself, and not because he deserved that, and maybe he wouldn't articulate it this way. I don't know anything about his beliefs, but God first has grace for you, and that gives you permission to allow yourself to receive that grace, and then to try to do better as you go forward.
Yeah.
And so to wrap that all around, back to the point about loneliness, which we were talking about. Well, I actually don't know if I know how to do that. But where did we come from? We came from...
Well, yeah. Here, I'll.
Sure.
Oh boy, I'll try.
Take a shot at it.
Yeah. I think. Yeah, I think that is something that people struggle with loneliness. Is they're hard on themselves, not willing to forgive themselves. Maybe don't think that there is something that is loving, that loves them. But they're also oftentimes struggling to improve themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst thing you can do, and is I would say the worst thing that you can do is just sit still and not do anything. once you start making those positive improvements, even if they're small and incremental, everything drastically improves in terms of that feeling, but also in terms of giving some direction to yourself. And then I think if we wrap that back even farther to our initial question about reconciling philosophy and faith, philosophy is a lot, and so is faith, a lot like working out. It's the rebuilding, the pruning, and the growth. And no matter how married I am, she can't lift the weights for me, you know?
Yeah.
She can make sure that I go to lift the weights, but I got to lift them. And she's got to lift hers, you know? But we're there for each other. And even though that's helpful, when I'm under the bar, you know, it's me. It's me under the bar.
Yeah.
And then if you want to take it even farther, let's say we're both under the bar, I still have to carry my weight. I still got to push that weight up.
And as the man, you have to carry more than your weight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is part of our burden and our blessing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's the pruning, and that's the helping, and that's what's going to take you from being lonely to, even when you're alone, having purpose, which sort of dissipates the loneliness.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Purpose being part of the solution to loneliness. And like I said, I think I would stand by what I said before about how I don't think loneliness will be entirely solved until we're really fulfilling our ultimate purpose, which is union with our Creator.
Absolutely.
And I don't think that happens now. But
I mean, I don't need chariots of fire, so probably not now.
Right, probably not now. But I do think taking steps towards parts of that purpose, ideally the biggest part you can, will start to do the job. And maybe this sort of this stage of life is part of just a necessary trial that you need to go through to make yourself the sort of person that even can fulfill the purpose of being at union with the Creator.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Okay. Well.
Love you, bro.
Good work.
And the audience.
Very good. Love you too.